So we're going to be looking at the bourgeois phase of the French Revolution. Bourgeois is actually a French word. It means the middle class. So that's where bougie comes from, right? Although bougie, I think, means more like people trying to be something more than they are, like richer than they are. That's probably true of a lot of members of the French lower class at this time, that they're trying to be bourgeois. So bourgeois is the adjective, and then bourgeoisie is the noun. So if I'm talking about the middle class doing something, it would be bourgeoisie. And if I'm describing the group, it would be bourgeois. It's also called the moderate phase because it's before things get really crazy around 1792, which we'll do in a separate video, or maybe I'll even be back by then, I hope. You do need to know this date, 1789. 1789 is a major turning point in world history. The American Revolution is different, right? The American Revolution is really kind of a war of independence of the Americans breaking away from the British. This is an existing government, one of the strongest, largest governments in all of the world, being toppled by their own people. So it's a little bit birds of a feather with the American Revolution, but also kind of different. The way I remember this date is 1789, 789, because it was hungry. So my objective for you today is to be able to take all of this information, as well as all of the information from your reading notes, and organize that into different categories. So if you're writing an essay, this is what you do, right? You would have a thesis about the overall causes of the revolution, and then you would talk about, well, these are the social causes, these are the intellectual, political, economic. This is where Sprague comes in so handy, because if you're ever asked to just discuss the outbreak of the revolution or analyze it or something, you can turn to these as easy body paragraphs for you. I would suggest that you would have roughly 3 pieces of information, 3 specific pieces of evidence to support each of these paragraphs about why there was a social breakdown, why there was political chaos, and so on. So try to keep track of some specificity in this as we go. I assume also that you'll be taking notes on this. I would also have your study guide out, because these terms are all on your study guide, and these are all terms that will be defined in the lecture, so you won't have to go looking for them. So the French monarchy, we've got a couple of people that you know about here, right? Maybe I can make this doc go away. Yeah, there we go. Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette. Just a reminder that she is the youngest daughter of Maria Theresa. It's many, many children, which also makes her the youngest sister of Joseph II, who will become the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire right before the French Revolution. And their marriage was a political one. They knew each other for about 2 days before their marriage. He was a whopping age of 16 and she was 15, so they were very young. But that was kind of a standard age to get married. And their marriage was meant to seal this alliance between France and Austria, which by the time of their marriage, that alliance was not super popular, in part because it had gotten France involved in the 7 Years' War, which I'll talk about in a minute here. The term Ancien Regime just means the ancient regime, in other words, pre-revolutionary France. So it's the existing government, the French monarchy, which is maybe somewhat enlightened, but still an absolute monarchy, before the French Revolution. So they are very young when they get married, and also he's only 19 when he comes to the throne. He turns 20 shortly thereafter. So he's really very young to rule, and is given a fairly bankrupt, he inherits a fairly bankrupt state. So first thing you need to know, the French monarchy is bankrupt. 50% of the throne's budget was spent just on the interest for the debt. So they're not actually paying down their debt, right? If you borrow $100 and they charge you 10% interest every year, the first year you owe 110, and then they add the interest onto that. He's never paying down the $100 he actually borrowed. He's just paying down the interest that is accrued on that debt. So that's half of his budget every year is just spent paying down or trying to keep the debtors at bay, trying to keep the banks from repossessing things. The reason they're in so much debt is, of course, Versailles, right? It was very expensive to build. It was very expensive to maintain. The annual maintenance of Versailles was about 25% of the king's budget. The year that he was coronated, which means the year he's made the king, was about 10% of that year's budget. And I believe that was in 1774. Also, they had just finished fighting a very expensive war against the British. That's the 7 Years' War is what it's called in Europe, but it's actually kind of a worldwide war, and we'll watch a crash course video on that. In the U.S., that U.S. portion is sometimes called the French and Indian War, but they're really sort of arenas of the same war. He's still paying off debt from Louis XIV's wars. Louis XIV fought a lot of wars against the Dutch, trying to expand his territory in the late 17th and early 18th century. But don't worry, guys, because the Queen still has enough money so that she can play peasant at her Hamlet. This is a picture of the Queen's Hamlet, which we talked about when we did our tour of Versailles. There's little gardens, there's a petting zoo. She can have a very sanitized, clean, little nice peasant life, right? Other thing you need to know about France is there's 3 estates, and they're not treated equally. So if you think about the Enlightenment, all men are created equal, this is very much not the case. So the clergy is the first estate, the nobility is the second estate, and the way I remember this is I think like God at the top. Whether you believe that or not, it just helps you remember clergy first estate, nobility kind of under that. The third estate is everybody else. That's 97% of the population. But one thing that you really need to make sure you don't do is just call them peasants. The third estate includes a lot of peasants for sure, but the peasants are not the same as the poor people in Paris. They lead very different lives. Peasants are farmers. The urban poor in cities might be things like fishmongers. They might work cleaning up the streets, things like that. They both lead very difficult lives, but also very different lives, and they don't necessarily want the same things. And peasant specifically refers to people in the countryside. So you need to separate those two. There's the urban poor, so urban meaning city, and then peasants in the countryside. Then it's also a lot of wealthy people. Some of the middle class or the members of the bourgeoisie actually were very wealthy, and really we call them middle class because of this kind of weird political structure. But some of them might have been very wealthy indeed. Some of those merchants were making quite a lot of money. But they're all subject to different laws than the first and the second estate. The peasants in particular had to pay the taille, which is direct land tax on the peasants. So that's a specific example of how they were expected to do something different because of their social class. A lot of the wealthier members of the bourgeoisie actually found ways to exempt themselves from taxes, and the clergy and the nobility are largely exempt completely. They had enough power to keep the state from taxing them in the previous century. The other thing that happens is the year before, 1787, 1788, there's a very poor harvest. So the price of grain is going to soar, which is going to make the price of bread soar. Now, bread is not just like, something you make a sandwich on. For the French, this is a really staple part of their diet. It's where the vast majority of calories are coming for most of the urban poor and the peasants. And some of them are so poor by 1789 that they're eating bread that's half made of sawdust because they can't afford the grain that they need. The sawdust is just filler. The urban poor in 1789, so those poor people in largely in Paris, are spending about 80% of their income on bread alone. And then the peasants weren't faring much better. They still had to pay the taille on top of these rising bread prices. Plus, don't forget, they have to pay things like rent. They still have to buy clothes. The vast majority of them probably tithe. So to tithe is to pay about 10% of your income to the church. So they're spending much more than they're bringing in. The king's financial ministers had tried to fix the state crisis, the state's financial crisis. They wanted to raise taxes on the first and second estate. Under Louis XV, they had attempted to do this, but the Parlement of Paris, there are actually judges, appellate judges, largely chosen from members of the nobility. They were the ones responsible for sort of registering laws into action, and every time the king tried to raise any kind of tax on the first and second estate, they just refused to sign the law into act. So to try to fix this and to try to kind of negotiate through all of this, the king is forced to call a meeting of the Estates-General. Now, we think of the Estates-General as being sort of similar to a parliament, but they're not quite yet. They don't have a whole lot of power in 1789. It's not that the king actually needed their consent to raise taxes, but he's hoping that they can discuss this financial crisis. They had traditionally voted by estate. So the first estate would get one vote, and the second estate would get another vote. And then the third estate, 97% of the population, would get all of the other votes. The Estates-General hadn't met since 1614. I want you to think about what's happened since 1614. What big thing in the 18th century that we talked about has changed the way that people think? This phrase, by the way, vote by estate, is how you can describe this kind of unequal voting situation. The Estates-General, when they first start meeting, start talking about its structure. They're not talking about the financial crisis. That's all Louis wanted them to talk about. Like, please, I just need some taxes. Just raise some money. No, they start talking about equality and whether this whole system is just, and they start debating the structure of the Estates-General. The third estate had been given a few more representatives than the first estate. The first and second estate combined had about 600 representatives, and then the third estate was given about 648, had they voted by head, which is what they would ask for. The third estate was like, look, we're most of the population. We should at least get a little bit more say than the first and second estate. And what's happened since 1614? Have you been thinking about that? What's happened since the last time they called? Kind of a big event, right? The Enlightenment. John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Voltaire, the philosophes, enlightened absolutism, Montesquieu, Diderot, the Encyclopedia, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, all of these terms were common now in France because the philosophes had brought the ideas of the Enlightenment to the French public, had made it accessible. They think of themselves differently. So when the third estate comes together at the Estates-General in 1789, they're coming together with this idea of a social contract and that they're owed something. Another term that you could add on there that I think is really important is natural rights, right? If the government fails to uphold our natural rights, we have not just a right, but a responsibility to overthrow them. And they felt that in this case, the government was failing to uphold their end of the social contract. So in January of 1789, a man named Abbé C.A., Abbé is, I think, his title, his full name was Emmanuel Joseph C.A., sends out a pamphlet called What is the Third Estate? And What is the Third Estate is written in this kind of dialogue. You're going to read it tonight, so don't worry about writing all of this down. He says, what is the third estate? Well, it's everything. We do all of the labor in France. What has it been up till now in the political order? Basically nothing. They'd always get outvoted by the first and second estate. What does it demand? To become something. And they start demanding in 1789 in January, when this is first published, so when the Estates-General has been called before it's actually met, this pamphlet is being spread around Paris, around the countryside. Everyone's reading it, and this is part of what gets them riled up before they actually meet. In May of 1789, when they come together then, they immediately start demanding to vote by head. They start demanding a restructuring of the Estates-General. The third estate starts demanding a voice. And Louis XVI is like, what about my taxes? So he has the third estate locked out of their meeting room. They'd been meeting at this big fancy room. Of course, it's a big fancy room in Versailles. And shockingly, they're able to find another room in France, as John Green says in his video, which I love, at a nearby tennis court. It's actually not on the palace grounds. It's in the city of Versailles, but not in the palace. On June 20th, 1789, they signed the tennis court oath after being locked out of the meeting room. And in that oath, they promised to form a national assembly. So they're going to be like a real parliament. And they promise to convene until there is a constitution. This is a painting of that meeting by Jacques-Louis David. Most of our revolutionary paintings are going to come from David. He's part of a member of what is called kind of the beginning of Romanticism or Neoclassicist. So he's really drawing these kind of emotional moments. And you can see in this painting here, by the way, all of the members of the Third Estate are anxiously and excitedly signing this tennis court oath. And there's even a couple members of the First and Second Estate, I think, that are supposed to be represented down here. There's one man who wouldn't sign it, and he's kind of grumpily protesting in the corner. David draws these, or paints these enormous paintings, and I'll show you some later examples of that too. Oops. Okay, so they meet at the tennis court. They say we're the National Assembly. And Louis is like, I'm a little bit nervous about this. Like, are you guys going to overthrow the state? What are you assembling about? Whose power are you taking away? Well, who has all of the power? That would be him, right? So he's afraid that they're really going to challenge his position. So he sends troops in to disband the National Assembly into Paris. They've gone back to Paris to talk about the Constitution. So on July 14th, 1789, a date you need to remember because it's a massive turning point, they stormed the Bastille. The Bastille is a prison, actually. It didn't have anyone particularly important in it. I think they had 7 prisoners in it, 5 ordinary criminals, pickpockets and things, and then 2 madmen. 18 die in this revolt, 73 are wounded, 7 guards are killed. And when the governor of the Bastille is sent out to negotiate with them, they cut off his head, put it on a pike, and paraded around the city. So I feel like this is a turning point, right? This is a spark. So anything that you talk about after this and the days immediately afterwards are probably going to be intensification of the revolution, but I would say it's kind of underway by now. Once you cut off somebody's head and parade it around the city, I think you could say things have changed. They're not just discussing, right? They're not just meeting, they're demanding. So this was mostly to get access to weapons. July 14th has become symbolically very important. The Bastille is still the name of a neighborhood in Paris. The prison doesn't exist anymore, but I happened to go there this year. My son was nice enough to be born on July 14th, just spontaneously. So for his 13th birthday, I'd always joked about how there'd be fireworks on his birthday in Paris. I had all these miles, so we decided I would take him to Paris. So on his 13th birthday, on July 14th, last summer, we went to the Bastille, which is now just this monument in the middle of this neighborhood. So this is a picture on July 14th of a monument to July 14th. We went to this street market, and when we came back, we saw the smoke in the air, and my son was like, "What's that?" And I was like, I don't know, let's not get too close, but of course we had to get a little closer to find out what it was. And it turns out it was part of these ongoing Yellow Vest demonstrations. The Yellow Vests are the working class, largely in Paris, but all across France, I think, who are protesting an increase in gas taxes, which is meant to help the environment, but they're saying is really hitting them harder than anybody else because it's a larger portion of their income. So there have been a lot of protests against this, and I'm just going to play this short video for you. You can see there the fire. They've set a trash can on fire there, and that's what was going on. And really all of the Parisians were like, whatever. A friend of mine had been in Paris that whole year. The Yellow Vest uprising started the fall before, and she said it had just become the norm. They were so common that subways were closed all of the time. It's very much a part of French culture, these kinds of frequent demonstrations and strikes. They still had fireworks at the Eiffel Tower. So this is we're right in front of the Louvre, and we're watching them from there because it's a little bit easier to get to from where we were staying. You can see the Eiffel Tower there in the background. It's hard to get pictures of fireworks at night because of the dark, but there you get an idea. And when we were there, they had all these cars were honking down the street, and I was like, cool, what's happening? And I thought they were all excited because it was Bastille Day. And then when we went out to the street, it turned out that they were all carrying flags. And I wasn't sure. I knew it was an Algerian flag, but I wasn't exactly sure what was going on. Algeria was a French colony, and so I think that they were protesting French treatment of Algerians in France. And then we heard shots, and we thought maybe we'll not hang around and find out. But I think they were actually tear gas, not actual guns. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but please keep calm and start the revolution. And I will be there as soon as I can and as soon as I'm able to sit up longer than it takes me to do this video. So hopefully that's helpful. What I'd like you guys to do for the rest of class, I'm going to have the sub explain to you. And I'll see you in a couple weeks. Bye.